So I want to speak on that psalm that we were looking at, or Hilary read to us. Psalm 139, called this Searching Times. Well, we went on holiday long ago, and we went bird watching down in the Somerset Levels. Well, Jenny does the bird watching, and I like watching the bird watchers. Those people who sit there, I like watching the twitchers, watching them there. And you know what they do? They watch for signs. They'll see a little movement in a hedge or in the grasses, and from just the movement, from the colouring of the feathers, from the under feathers, from the way that they fly, the flight pattern, from the noises, the sounds, they'll be able to say that's one of those little Chetty's warblers. Oh. But it strikes me that they have a real interest in those birds. They're so interested. They're so absorbed by them that they just love to identify them and to see all those all their little attributes in their sights and their sounds. They know what they're looking for. Somehow they want to see the bird in all its glory, doing all its bird things, its song and its flight and they're all different. To me, they look like little brown jobs, but apparently they're all different. God searched the psalmist and knew him. That's how our psalm begins. Lord, you have searched me and knew me. Well, I think that shows that God is very interested in the psalmist. He's very interested in us, just like those bird watchers love those sounds. God is so interested in us. They look for the outward signs, the song, the feathers, but God looks so often for those inward signs, those motives and intentions. He really wants to know us deep down. He wants to see the hidden things. Why? The bird watcher wants to be able to identify the bird. I think God wants us to be true to our Christian identity, true to our identity as those made in his image. He's looking for the signs that we can be who he made us to be. He can see us in all our glory, that where our faith and our lives match each other. There's no contradiction between what we say and what we do. So I think this psalm is about God's interest in us. Those twitchers, they will talk to you for hours for what they see. But I think God is even more interested in us than the bird watchers in those birds that they love. Which way are we going? Thank you. So wisdom comes from meditating on God's ways. I think this psalm came out of the psalmist's experience. He's been through tough times. You can remember those times that David went through before he was king. Saul was chasing him. Sometimes he was even in exile. His life was in danger. Sometimes he had to live in caves. Any of those incidents. So David has been through those tough times on the way to receiving God's promise. And this psalm comes out of what he's learned about God through those tough times, through meditating on God's ways. The psalmist has been through tough times. There's an avocet, beautiful birds, long beaks, very good at just able to filter out the things they want from the water. They're kind of waders. And why they're here, they're on the Somerset Levels, just not far from Bridgewater, because people have made an environment which attracts them. They've made it perfect. So why should those birds decide to end up in the southwest of England? Because people have made an environment to attract them so that they can be themselves and survive in that area. I believe that God is doing the same for us. God works through our circumstances. God works in the environment of our lives, the things which happen to us and do to us, to change us and make us what he wants us to be, so we become our true selves. So here's this psalm written in testing times. And as you may have heard when Hilary read it, it tells us things about God which I'm not saying we learned them in Sunday school, but certainly if you've been to Bible school, you'll have learned them Firstly, God knows everything. God is omniscient. The teachers say omnis, he knows everything. Omni. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere. And he's omnipotent. He's all powerful. Those are wonderful things to know about God. But I think in this psalm, the psalmist has moved from knowing those in his head, as it were, knowing them as a creed he's recited from his childhood, from actually knowing them in his experience and for reality in his life. He moves from a doctrinal belief to personally trusting that God knows everything about him, that God is everywhere with him, that God is all powerful and can resource him in every way. So he's moving from that theoretical knowledge, if you like, to a more practical knowledge. The psalmist is reflecting on how he got to know God better, in other words. I'm just saying, let this psalm resonate with your experience as you think of how God has dealt with you over the years. As you think of things that you have been through and got through, realizing that God knows you. He's surrounded you. He's sustained you, tested you. In other words, we often learn backwards, don't we? We look back at our experience and say, oh, God was there. I've come through it. I didn't realize he was there, but he was there. So we learn often backwards after we've been through the experience. So this trials, these testing, our experience teaches us, God's purpose, how to live going forward. We take the lessons from the past and translate them into our lives going forward. And just a reminder, we find out what we really love and trust when we go through hard times, don't we? Who do you call upon when you go through hard times? What do you really feel upset about losing? That's probably the most important thing to you. So we learn about ourselves, and God is watching over that process so that we can learn things about ourselves as well as learning things about him. So the things which we really love are the things which we are afraid of losing over tough times. So those first few verses from the Psalm, just 1 to 6, just refresh your minds. We know, Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit, when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out, my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. You hem me in behind before. You've laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Well, what can we say? We can say he's an open book to God. He's an open book to God. There's a crested grebe. God knows all about those grebes, and he's provided that environment for them. And even when there are no bird watchers watching them, God is watching them, delighting in them, delighting in them. They're an open book. He knows how they survive. And these are the birds which they carry their young on their backs as they're swimming around, giving them those first swimming lessons. Sorry. Right. God knows me inside out. He knows me better than I know myself. So that's why he allows some things to happen, because he knows you need them when you are not sure you need them. He knows me better than he knows myself. He seeks to know me intimately. He seeks to, you know that word know, it's a very, very strong word. It's the word for relational intimacy. Adam knew Eve. It talks about their relationship as man and woman, man and wife. God knows us, wants to know us in the same way. So his knowledge of us is not just thank you. It's good to have a mobile brain, isn't it? Spare brain. Thank you, Josh. God's knowledge is not just data collection, but it's observation in order to build a relationship. What God knows and learns about it, he uses in order that our relationship with him may grow. He loves us. He knows us. He observes us. He wants to do what's best for us. My birthday's coming up soon, and I'm afraid I have a rather horrible habit. I don't like people to buy me birthday presents. I say, I'll buy myself a present and send you the bill. Because I don't like people wasting money, and I don't like having gifts I can't. So I'm very selfish, but that's the only person who doesn't do that is my son Josh. It's probably has good reasons, but the one reason is he has observed me, and more often than not, I won't say it's always right. More often than not, he will get me a present which I actually want. Because he loves me enough to study me in all my funny ways. And God is like that. He observes us because he loves us, knows what's best for us and good for us. So we know the Lord, we let God know our secrets. We were thinking a bit about that last week, weren't we? Praying without pretending. Think of the prodigal son. How did he know himself to be loved? We've sung those words this morning, haven't we? I know that you love me. We've sung those words this morning. How did he know his love? Well, when he came back to his father, in all his dirt, in all his filth, empty pockets, having survived that long journey, smelling no doubt just nothing to show for himself at all. You remember all those wonderful stories of likes of Dick Whittington, the young child goes away and he comes back and he's the mayor of London or something. Well, this is the opposite. The prodigal was nothing. He was a complete, utter washout and failure. That's when he knew himself to be loved, wasn't it? When the father came running to him and put his arms on his shoulder and said, we're going to party. So as, in other words, he let himself be known. He let himself be known. Has God's knowledge of you always led you to wonder and to praise? Have you welcomed him knowing you that well? I'm always in God's presence. Those next few verses. Remember that saying we've often, one we'll know best perhaps, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, and I settle on the far side of the sea, you even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. Hiding from God goes back a long way, doesn't it? Remember the Garden of Eden? Adam and Eve, they did that hiding thing, trying to hide from God. Of course, a useless thing, but it showed that they didn't want to attend to God. I suppose we often hide from God by being busy, don't we? Haven't got time to think, haven't got time to do business, haven't got time to get through to him, to engage with him. So often it's through busyness that we withdraw from God. So this hiding is an inward thing, isn't it? We're just keeping our distance, not quite sure what his motives are. Not quite sure if he might call us to go and be missionaries in Nigeria. So we take a step back. So I'm just suggesting to you some of these words that God's knowledge of us and his presence with us can appear to be oppressive. Certainly if we doubt his goodness and his wisdom, if we doubt his intentions for us, if we doubt that he really knows us well, it can be oppressive. Like those words in verse 5, you hem me in. Don't give me room to move. Don't let me express myself as I want. Is there that suggestion there? I'm just putting the thought in your mind. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? As if you think that might be a better option. And I think the psalmist has been in that position. He's been fleeing from God. I think David was perhaps disobedience. And he fled from God, but he realized wherever he fled, God was with him. There's nowhere where God is not. He was never beyond God's care, even when he was in exile, even when he was on the run. He was never beyond God's care. So I think there's a change of tone. Verse 5, you hem me in, but then verse 10, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. You'll steer me with your hand through my suffering. Even though I may be on the wrong path, you will still be there to steer me and bring me back. You see, I'm not sure, but I don't think this is the knowledge of the secret police. I don't think God's knowledge of us and presence is the surveillance state. God just checking to make sure. But it's the knowledge of the aspirational parent wanting the best for their child, knowing them, studying them. So I think his experience has led him to take away that sense that God may be meddling with his life, interrupting his pleasure and his fun and his plans, but actually God knowing what's best for him and wanting the best outcomes. God has a good purpose in mind and not a sour purpose. Psalmist sense that God's light penetrates the darkness, and that sense, even the darkness and the light are the same. He can think back and say, even when I thought there was no hope, even when I thought no one could see me and I was all alone, I realize now that you saw me. Somehow you brought me out of that situation. Even in the darkness, God is there. God doesn't want us to live in the darkness. He wants us to live in the light of joy and peace. That's a marsh harrier, that bird there. Beautiful bird, but I have to say, not a friend of little birds. Marsh harrier is a destructive force, a beautiful, wonderful, God-created destructive force. But God is not like that. God's presence makes the psalmist actually feel safe and loved and wanted. And of course, God works. How does God work in our lives? He works through other people so often, doesn't he? So may I counsel you to be one of those helpers when someone is going through a difficult time, their little darkness. Will you be one of God's helpers? One of those interpreters who can interpret some of God's ways and purposes to people. Where is God in all this? Well, God often worked through that. See how he worked through Joseph. See, in Joseph's life, Joseph had difficulties, but God met him there. See how he worked in Paul's life. We can interpret God's ways to each other. Will you be one of God's interpreters? And let's just do these verses here. God is omnipotent. You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the number of them. So here he's realizing that God is the God who sustains him. Our life will last as long as God wants it to last. He's the one who sustains us from the cradle to the grave, even before the cradle. Before our mothers knew we were there, God knew we were there. Before our mother had any kind of sense that she was expecting, God knew. He knows us right from the beginning, and he'll know us at death and after death. He's the omnipotent, the life giver, sustaining us all our days. We sang that song, didn't we? That God, he's faithful to us all our days long, all the day long. He's faithful to us. We needn't fear about the future. The God who brought us through the womb and all those intricacies of the forming of life and that amazing development process, he's right there to the end. He's invested a lot in us. So when the world thinks we're less useful because we're old and forgetful and grey and stiff, God doesn't. So God gives us life from the womb, even after death. God shapes us from day one of our life. He knows us so well. He shapes us. He knows our resources. He knows our abilities. He knows our tendencies. He knows our DNA. He shapes our life around his knowledge. He doesn't ask us to do what we can't do, but he knows us so well. I remember being in Bristol and being frustrated. I was living in Southby, but I had nowhere to preach. Went to a church, but the pastor was a very good preacher. Had no room for me. But God knew Nairobi was waiting for someone to do what I could do. So in Southby, God matched me to Nairobi, where I was well able to talk my head off, and everyone else's too. He knows our resources. He knows our traits. He knows our possibilities. He knows his plans, therefore, fit us perfectly. We're not pre-programmed. He doesn't take away our freedom, but what he has for us is fully appropriate. That's why obedience is the best way. Because when God asks us to do something, it fits us, it suits us, it matches us, and we are able to do it by God's grace. And this wonderful thought just to end with, God's interest in us never dies. How precious to me are your thoughts. How vast is the sum of them. As if God can't get enough of us. I'll even use the word, God is besotted with us. He's thinking of us all the time. Always on his mind. Because he always wants to include us in his plans and help us to use the things that he has born in us and developed in us. He has an undying interest in our lives. Even when nothing seems to be happening, we'll say, God, what are you wanting me to do? That prayer that Jenny prayed, Lord, what's the day for? God's interest in us is as much as the grains of sand on the seashore. And he values the end as the beginning and everything in between. So I'm saying be faithful. I think I must have told this story to anyone who was here 15 years ago. Probably heard an old lady, an old sister, been in the church many years, loved the Lord, very faithful. Pastor comes round to visit her. It looks pretty clear it's her last week, her last day even. Pastor prays a blessing on her. She says, thank you, Lord. I'm going to be with Jesus. Thank you, Pastor. The pastor just had to leave the room. And she said, Pastor, my offering for Sunday is on the table there. Faithful to the end. Faith. That's what he calls us. He's faithful to us. So you see how the psalm ends. We won't quite go into those last few verses. But the psalmist, in the end, he says, Lord, search me. Lord, try my heart. So what at first may have seemed a bit of a fearsome prospect, Lord, you've known me, and you're with me even when I'm not quite sure I should be here. Lord, please search me. Lord, please test me. Please help me to live in your omniscience, that you know everything. In your omnipresence, that you're always with me. And in your, help me to live in that, because that's the way to live without anxiety. That's the way to live without anxiety. See if there are any anxious thoughts in me and lead me in the everlasting way. May God bless us. Let's just bow in prayer. Thank you, Lord. I just wanted to say, do your family know your story of God's faithfulness to you? Remember, we had an elder here, Amos Pike. And I think in his 8th decade, he wrote his life story. I'm not saying it became a bestseller, but everyone who read it was amazed at God's faithfulness in his life. Do your children know your story of God's faithfulness? I know sometimes it's quite difficult to talk to our children. Do your grandchildren know your story of God's faithfulness to you? Just think it's good to write it out. Take the opportunity. Lord, I just want to bear witness that you have been faithful, that you do know me, you have been with me, and that you keep me in life as long as that's your plan. Thank you, dear Father,